Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webcast, SES Advisors webcast on ESOP rebalancing and reshuffling. I'm Brian Wurpts. I head up the Plan Administration Services Group for SES Advisors, and I'm here with Diane Fanelli. Diane is one of our senior administrators at SES. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have a question as we go along, feel free to enter it in your chat window. We'll try to answer questions as we move along through the presentation. If it's something not related to the slide that we are on or something else, we'll address the question at the end. We'll try to leave plenty of time to address any questions you have. And as the chat window says, if you'd like a copy of our slides, just leave a message in the chat window before the end of the presentation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Diane, who's going to take us through some of the terminology used in the IRS guidance that was recently issued on these two topics.
Hi. Well, the first thing that we're going to talk about is recycling. And recycling, as many of you know, is when participants receiving a distribution receive cash and their shares are purchased in other participants with money from other participants' accounts, so that those shares are recycled throughout the plan. And the source of that cash may be accumulated earnings in the plan, or it can be new employer contributions. That's just by way of definition of what recycling is. We're going to go through a few of these definitions before we get into the meat of the presentation. So,
and Diane, would you say that's what happens most of the time in an ESOP when benefits are paid out, that shares are reallocated to the participants?
Yes, from my experience, most of the times that's what happens. Shares are recycled among remaining participants. One of the other definition type things that we want to go over are haves versus have-nots. And many of you probably have heard this if you've been involved in other ESOP discussions or attend conferences. But generally, this is the condition where there's big disparity between groups of ESOP participants according to when participation started. For example, if there's a loan and it's been paid off and most of those shares that were in suspense with the loan have been allocated to participants, then what happens? There's no more shares to allocate to new participants. And so you have the haves that have been there for a while and the have-nots who really have nothing to receive in the future. And sometimes it's worsened by the fact if you have a lot of dividends or sub-S earnings and you're using them to fund the debt service or even the repurchase obligation, because those dividends and earnings are obviously being allocated to people who already have shares. And so it's a case of the rich get richer in terms of the stock in your plan.
It's fair to say that that's fairly common for a leveraged ESOP. Wouldn't you agree, Diane, that ESOP sponsors are usually looking to maximize their tax deductions early on,
right,
that they're trying to get rid of their debt? So this is not an uncommon result in the leveraged ESOP.
It's not uncommon, and it's perfectly logical, and if you thought about it up front, you'd come to that conclusion. And yet, time and again, you know, an ESOP plan sponsor says, wow, I'm making my last payment, or I just paid my loan this year, what about my new people? So it's kind of like, sometimes it doesn't hit you until it's actually ready to happen. And the other next definition that we're going to go over is, you know, HCEs. I'm sure that everybody knows what an HCE is, but just in case you don't, for participants earning more than $110,000 in the prior year, That amount's indexed every year. You have to make sure on many, many levels that the plan does not discriminate in their favor. I think probably everybody is familiar with that term, but if not, we're happy to discuss that with you later. Now what happened is rebalancing and reshuffling have been around for a while, and the IRS came out last year with some guidelines because for quite some time they kind of, you know, pussyfooted around, and then once people started putting, you know, language in their plans, I think they decided to take a look at it. And so part of the guidelines came out, and, you know, what the preface to the whole thing was is that the right to a particular form of benefit, for example, employer stock, is not a protected benefit under the code. And so that was an important, you know, thing for them to come out and say before they came out with these guidelines about reshuffling and rebalancing. Contributions and benefits, again, can't discriminate in favor of HCE, so they reiterated that. Benefits, rights, and features have to satisfy a current availability and an effective availability requirement. And so even though your plan may state something properly, if actually what happens is in reality it's not working properly, that's an issue for the IRS. They've also reiterated that terminees can be tested as a separate group for applying non-discrimination rules, which will become important when we go further through this presentation. And where consent to a distribution is required, which in most cases it is, the consent is not valid if a significant detriment is imposed, if you don't consent. And so this is, again, something that's going to come up later in the presentation, but it's important to understand these general guidelines if you're going to understand the specifics of the guidance that IRS provided. Now, one thing that was new that they came out with, it said that provisions must be part of the plan document, and those provisions have to include to whom the language applies, how many shares or the amount of cash to transfer in or out, timing, and the manner in which transfer will occur. This is pretty much, and I'll see what Brian has to say with it, new, because even though a lot of plans maybe were using rebalance or reshuffling, it wasn't specified in the plan document in the past. And one thing that they added was that you must preclude amounts diversified to be mandatorily returned to participant accounts. And again, we'll get back to what that means specifically when we get into the details of rebalancing and reshuffling.
Yeah, I would add that plans have been doing both of these things for at least 10 or 15 years, some maybe even longer, but that much of this guidance didn't exist until the Cincinnati office of the IRS asked the Washington office to write a technical advice memorandum giving the Cincinnati office, which does the plan determination letter reviews, some guidance on what Washington believed should be the guidelines for doing these two features. So I don't think anything on this list is a big surprise. I think one thing that's unsettled is this bullet point about the plan document language. Most plans in our experience are not that specific about reshuffling or rebalancing. They have only limited language, and the IRS is asking you to have more specific language. It remains to be seen exactly how that language will evolve now that we have the new guidance.
So first I'm going to go through the overview of the rebalancing, and then I'll turn it over later to Brian for the reshuffling. So rebalancing, basically the IRS came up with its definition, which is here in quotes, of of what they say rebalancing is. The mandatory transfer of employer securities into and out of participant ESOP accounts, usually on an annual basis, designed to result in all participant accounts having the same proportion of employer securities. And what we have on the next slide, for those of you who haven't been involved with rebalancing, is a little example of how rebalancing works. Okay, in column A we have the stock, the employer stock, and in the second column we have the other investments, and the third column is the total account balances. So at the close of the period, there's $400,000 in stock, $100,000 in cash or other investments, for a total of $500,000. And on a plan overall basis, that split is 80%, 20% stock to cash. If we look at it person by person, you can see that John Doe, his ratio is 78.8, 21.2. Look down at Jane Doe, her ratio is a little bit different. And then Rosetta Stone, who maybe is a person who entered the plan more recently, has significantly more cash than stock. After the rebalance, everybody's total amount, so the last column total, is exactly the same in value, but you can see that each person's ratio is 80% stock and 20% other investments, the same as the plan total. This is a fairly simple concept. Not a lot of plans to date that we have seen implement this, but this is exactly how rebalancing works. One of the reasons why you would use rebalancing is to help alleviate the haves and have-not issues in the plan by moving shares into accounts of current employees, and that's something that we talked about earlier. If you have new participants who do not have shares in their accounts, they may have cash in their accounts but not shares. If you rebalance, that's a way for them to get shares in their accounts.
So Diane, in this case, we're contributing cash to the plan, but other than some forfeitures being reallocated, there aren't a lot of shares for new employees to share in because we don't have any more shares in loan suspense. This is a way to move shares out of the long-time participant accounts and into the new participant accounts without the account values changing as a result of that exchange. Fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. And in fact, I skipped over bullet point 1, but if you are recycling shares, which we talked about earlier, so when people terminate, you're actually contributing cash to the plan to fund those distributions, and people who are continuing to be active participants in the plan are in effect getting the shares from the people's accounts who terminated. And so those people are, long-term participants have more and more shares, even though you're putting cash into the plan. So if you're recycling shares, that can make the situation worse in terms of your haves versus have-nots. One thing that IRS did come out and say is that you cannot use rebalancing to correct 409P failures, but that you can use it to help avoid future failures. For those of you who aren't familiar with 409P, it only applies to S corporations, and if you have participants who are considered to be disqualified participants under 409P, maybe if you use rebalancing, you can help avoid that situation where you're nearing a non-allocation year.
Or to avoid a person becoming a disqualified person, and those disqualified persons are basically people who have larger concentrations of ownership in your plan. So this again is only S corps, and that person might own more than 10% or be approaching 10% ownership on an individual basis, or might be part of a family group that owns more than 20%. And the non-allocation year, which is what you're really trying to avoid, is where those people collectively own more than half of the company. So IRS has said you can implement this as a way of moving stock out of these accounts as part of the rebalancing feature, but you cannot correct a failure by adopting a rebalancing feature.
And then, of course, the other underlying result is that it provides, in effect, some diversification for all participants. Because suppose you were not rebalancing and you had active participants with shares, and in the future you just kept, after the loan was paid off, you kept contributing cash, then all of your new participants would have, newer participants would have mostly cash, and older participants would have mostly shares. By rebalancing, you're in effect forcing a type of diversification so that everybody has some cash and some shares in their accounts. Whoops. Some of the benefits, again, diversification for long-time participants, and addresses the have and have-not concerns of sponsors of ESOPs. Potential concerns is that, sometimes if the company's stock is outperforming or underperforming other investments, you can have concerns from participants. And you really can't make your decision on whether or not you want to rebalance on what your stock is doing at a particular time. It's a long-term decision. It's a decision for the plan in general, and it really shouldn't have anything to do with what your stock is doing in a particular year.
Yeah, we would recommend that you take a long-term view of this. When you consider adopting an account rebalancing provision, you should be committed to doing it in the long run. A lot of companies, and we'll get into this a little bit at the end, can get into trouble when they're thinking about, well, their stock is a bargain right now, we ought to be buying some of it back. Those are bad reasons to adopt either rebalancing or reshuffling. You want to think about this as a benefits policy. And then the fiduciary concerns are a couple ways of addressing this. You're going to have non-stock investments in your trust. It's an assumption here that you do, because rebalancing without any significant cash or investment balance is really a non-starter. There's nothing to rebalance. So this assumes that the company is funding cash into the plan in order to rebalance, and that might be pre-funding repurchase obligation. It might just be providing another form of retirement benefit in the ESOP. But when you do that, the fiduciaries of the ESOP trust, while they have an exemption from being diversified with respect to employer securities, that exemption doesn't apply to other cash and other investments. So you either need to develop an investment policy and pay attention to monitoring those investments, or you need to make these accounts self-directed. So some plans will provide for self-direction, like a 401k plan, where the participant makes elections concerning the investments.
Okay. Some other issues are that you have to coordinate your rebalancing with your diversification. If your diversification elections are distributed in cash, there's not too many issues. So in other words, if people diversify, you give them cash and then they go either invested in an IRA or someplace else, or even in your 401k plan, that's not an issue. But if you are an ESOP who is having 3 investments available within your ESOP for your participants to use for diversification, then those amounts that are transferred in those accounts can't be considered for future rebalancing. So once they're moved out of the account for diversification purposes, they remain in the plan, but they're not considered in future rebalancing calculations. Some other best practices that we've come up with in terms of rebalancing are that the rebalancing should be the last step in every allocation period. So, payments are posted, investment income is posted, forfeitures are posted, and you come up with essentially a preliminary balance, what it would have looked at before, what it would have looked like before rebalancing, and then you would go ahead and do that last step, which is the rebalancing. It should not change anything that happened during the year, whether it's earnings or unrealized gain, losses, dividends, because once again, it's the last step after what would have been your balance. It has to result in exchange of assets of equal value. It can't reduce a participant's diversification rights under the plan. And our suggestion is that if you adopt it earlier rather than later in the plan's life cycle, that it's most effective. Because then you have it in effect while the share price is going up and down, while you have turnover, people coming in, people coming out, and overall it's just a better situation to adopt rebalancing earlier rather than later.
You don't have to explain what rebalancing is if you have the rebalancing provision from the outset, even though there may be little or no effect early on until you start funding some cash in. If you're thinking about adopting a new plan, having rebalancing from the start can alleviate some of the explanation and employee education that goes into explaining why this change is being made in the plan if you adopt it later. And whenever you adopt a change, people will look at hindsight, well, you adopted rebalancing and our stock value went up and I'm holding more stock, so I don't like this. Why are you doing this? Having it early on will alleviate some of that. So before we move on to reshuffling, we've got a few questions to address. The first is a concern potentially about a shift of stock to non-fully vested participants. Does that increase forfeitures? And the answer to that is no, and the reason for that is we're exchanging assets between participants of equal value. So whenever we rebalance, we're moving stock and other investments between participants. The value of the account did not change as a result of the rebalance. And likewise, the breakdown of the vested versus non-vested accounts was not affected by the rebalance. Of course, the investments themselves, the employer stock and the other investments, are going to change value every year. So, potentially, depending on how the stock performs versus the other investments, there could be some changes, but fundamentally it doesn't increase forfeitures to adopt a rebalancing provision. We've got another question. Do we see many plans that offer self-directed other investments in the ESOP versus requiring the funds to be moved to another employer-sponsored plan? The first part of that is we hear a lot more talk about potentially offering self-directed other investments. The second part of the question, most employers move diversified balances out of the plan and into a 401k. But I would say if you're adopting a rebalancing, your primary motivation is to preserve cash in the plan, partly to address future repurchase obligation. So you're planning to hold some cash assets for a longer time period. You're going to leave those balances in the plan. In my experience, at least, the fiduciaries of those plans that are doing rebalancing are just adopting investment policies and are getting advice on how to invest that cash, considering that it's going to be invested for a longer time period than perhaps small cash balances that might have lingered in your plan short term. So as more and more plans adopt rebalancing, we're going to see more turn to self-direction to address the fiduciary concerns, but so far I don't myself have a single client doing it, just a few that have talked about doing it. Diane, similar experience? Or?
I don't have any clients right now that have self-directed accounts, and but I think the question really is mainly focused on diversification, not rebalancing. As Brian said, if you diversify, are you setting up accounts within your plan, or are you diversifying funds out of the plan? And I would say 98% of mine are moving the money out of the ESOP and not providing diversification within the plan. So they're related topics, the rebalancing and the rediversification, but it's not exactly the same thing.
And there was a follow-up question about the tracking, the self-directed versus others. So I don't think we have a lot of insight to give you on plans that are self-directing, just because we haven't seen any, I believe, to date. The segregation, one of the reasons that you typically leave them in omnibus accounts or pooled trust accounts is that the plan sponsor wants to have flexibility over how those funds are used in the future. And primarily they're used to repurchase shares from participants who are leaving. So how the self-directed works out in practice, probably work out much like a 401k plan, but the participants, are going to have those other investments moving in or out at the direction of either the trustee or the plan administrator, depending on how the plan document language is worded.
And one more thing I just want to reiterate, and that's about the fiduciary concerns. I mean, in a lot of cases, you've already jumped through a lot of hoops in terms of your fiduciary responsibility on your 401k plan. You have advisors. You've taken care to choose funds. You have committees looking at that. And so you've done all that work. And so if you want to set up those funds inside your ESOP, you have to do all that within the ESOP. And I would think that, most employers are saying, hey, we've already done it. Let's just move the money out of the ESOP. We already have done our fiduciary job on the K plan, and people can invest over there, and they have, a great array of funds, and they're picking their own funds, and it's self-directed, and that's a much easier way to go, and not a lot of liability on us.
Yeah, that's really common with money that's going to leave the plan anyway, like diversification. So that's by far the most common for diversification. In rebalancing, it's money that's usually going to stay within the plan because the company doesn't want to lose the ability to use that cash to repurchase its employer securities. So in that case, it's more commonly an internal investment policy set by the plan fiduciaries, but we're likely to see more self-directed accounts in that arena as time goes on. We have another question. When segregating assets, can you use target funds for each person individually, or do you need to use the same type of investment? Chris, that's our next topic, so we're going to address your question as we go through the slides over the next 20 minutes or so. And that is actually our next topic, reshuffling. Just to clarify one point, SES has always used the term segregation for what we're about to describe. IRS chose to use the term reshuffling. At least as far as I'm concerned, reshuffling and rebalancing before this guidance came out meant the same thing. It was all rebalancing. Reshuffling was a conversion or a swap of assets between company stock and other investments such that everybody held the same proportion of each at the end of the day. IRS chose to use the term reshuffling, so I don't want to cause confusion, but we're going to go with their term for the rest of the presentation. But basically, segregation, reshuffling, or less commonly conversion all mean the same thing. And here, the IRS definition is the mandatory transfer of employer securities into or out of ESOP accounts that is not designed to result in an equal proportion of employer securities in each account. So while the rebalancing definition is designed to give everybody an equal share, reshuffling is not designed to be equal. And we're going to expand on that because there's a very specific purpose for this type of exchange. We're going to go back to our example of our trust account. This is the same ABC stock, other investments, total assets of $500,000 in this example. So we have the same 80-20 breakdown in the overall trust assets, and the same balances and breakdown in the participant accounts. But this time, instead of giving everyone an equal proportion, we are converting Rosetta Stone, the terminated participant's account balance, and what we're doing is we're repurchasing all of the employer securities in the account. So the $20,000 she had in employer securities is going away, and it's being replaced by other investments. Excuse me. So before we reshuffled or segregated, Rosetta Stone had $75,000 in her account, of which about a quarter was employer securities and 3/4 was other investments. And we are converting her employer securities into other investments. This is a very common feature of ESOPs and quite popular, particularly at the point that the loans have been fully repaid. You typically want to get a jump start on your repurchase obligation. You start funding some cash in the plan. You want to get some shares to new employees. And frankly, a lot of plan sponsors would rather not see these terminated participants enjoying a ride up in the employer security value over time, because like most ESOPs, you probably have deferred your distributions for up to 5 years for larger balances. For anything larger than, say, a $5,000 or $1,000 balances, you typically defer payout for 5 years, and that's designed to give you, as a company, time to budget for and fund your repurchase obligation. So a lot of ESOPs have segregation or reshuffling provisions that say, at the plan administrator or at the trustee's discretion, if the trust has sufficient cash, the plan will exchange assets of equal value for company stock of equal value, just as we demonstrated in the example with Rosetta Stone. All right, there's a question, would a retiree be handled the same as a terminated employee? We're going to talk in the next couple slides about who we're segregating and on what basis we are, and we'll address how a trustee might, or a retiree might be handled differently than a regular terminated employee. So to recap, the terminated participants are receiving other investments, and they receive these investments typically from active participants. It's cash that you have contributed or earnings on cash from prior periods. Might be dividends or earnings distributions, but cash from active participants in exchange for stock in their account. The active participants receive the flip side of that coin. They're receiving stock from the terminated participants in exchange for the other investments. So in our example, Rosetta Stone was being divested of about $20,000 worth of stock. The Jane and John Doe, the active participants, you'll see their company stock balances increasing as a result of the exchange. But again, not proportionately. We aren't forcing them to the 80-20 breakdown. We are just exchanging equal value. All right, so the main purpose of this is that the terminated participants no longer share in the investment experience of the company stock. And that means that they're diversified, so they don't have the risk that the company stock will fall. They have other investments. And of course, they're not going to enjoy an increase in the company stock value. But now, anyone in the audience who might say, well, that's a great deal. I'm going to buy the stock out while it's cheap. I'm going to put them in a money market account and don't look back. Well, you have some fiduciary duties here. You can't just put those balances in a money market account and not look back. You have a fiduciary duty to invest those investments prudently. You are given an opportunity as a fiduciary to consider the time frame of the investment. So these are terminated participant accounts. They may be fairly short-term in nature. So you can consider that in your evaluation of appropriate investment. And that might mean that you put something in more fixed income or a less risky investment rather than, say, a basket of equities, something that you might do for an active participant. But you do need to go through that exercise, take a look at the age of the terminated participants, how far they are from receiving their benefits, set up an investment policy, and go ahead and invest the proceeds in something that's going to earn better than, the less than 1% they might get out of a checking or money market account. All right, moving on. Segregation. So why would we do it? Well, two sides of the coin, depending on who you are and what the company stock value is doing. For terminated participants, they get some diversification. ESOPs by their nature are not diversified at all, and we all accept that, understand that. But it's not the best retirement policy when you consider minimizing risk. ESOP participants typically do very well, and ESOP companies have higher retirement benefits than non-ESOP companies. But there is more risk in the ESOP participants' retirement benefit when you compare two people with the same level of retirement benefits. The less diversified is more risky. So what we're doing for the terminated participants is we're segregating them, we're diversifying them. What does it do for the active employees? Well, it provides another source of shares for your new employees. They are, after all, the people that are doing the most directly to create the success in the business that's creating the appreciation in the first place. So once I'm gone from your organization, I'm no longer making a contribution. You might say I'm no longer responsible for what happens in the company. So segregation is not a bad idea on that basis. I'm no longer putting the effort in. Why should I share in the success of the business as the stock appreciates? Of course, that can reverse if the stock appreciation or the growth of the stock reverses in declining stock values. I'd probably prefer to be segregated as a terminated participant. I'd prefer that you not segregate as an active participant. Other concerns with segregation, what if there's not sufficient cash available to segregate? Again, as we said early on, the language typically makes segregation discretionary decision, usually annually, and typically dependent on having cash available in the trust. So the plan administrator or trustee might be off the hook. They can suspend segregation when there's not sufficient cash in the trust to segregate. But what happens from a participant expectation benefits policy perspective? Well, if I'm terminating employment, and this is pretty common when things reverse, economy turns south, the stock value goes down, you might have a big layoff, for example. And if you've been reshuffling or segregating for a number of years, those participants that terminate perhaps due to a layoff, well, they know what's been going on. They talk to their former colleagues. You know, you've communicated that segregation is happening. They've seen it on benefit statements in the past. Well, if you stop all of a sudden, that's going to be an unpopular benefits decision. And typically companies will stop because there's no cash in the trust or because the stock value is expected to decline substantially. Well, that's going to be a very unpopular outcome. So I would encourage you to view reshuffling segregation the same way that we encourage you to view rebalancing, and that is to make it more or less a permanent policy when you adopt it. To at least take a very long view of it, that we're going to commit to doing this and we're going to commit to funding it going forward. We've seen a couple plans where things turned south that suddenly stopped segregating, very unpopular. What I would encourage you instead to do is, if the cash need for segregation is greater than the cash that the board would agree to put in the plan, is more than what is an appropriate benefit, that you would take whatever cash you do contribute to the plan, even if it's far less than the amount you need to segregate. I would encourage you to partially segregate accounts. And that's not just for the benefits policy side. It's a potential discrimination issue if you have intermittent or incomplete segregation. We have to view the terminees as a group, and when you're partially segregating accounts or you don't fully segregate, we have to take a long view and test that. And if it favors highly compensated employees, you have a discrimination problem. This is also why we would recommend, if you're going to do partial or you come to a point where you stop reshuffling or segregating, that you adopt a rebalance provision along with it, such that the segregated accounts would all be proportionately segregated if you cannot fully fund the segregation. So there was an earlier question about how would we handle a retiree versus a terminated employee. One of the requirements of reshuffling is that you have to have a policy about how you determine who is segregated, when they're segregated. And there are a few different approaches to this. The most common that I run into is you segregate based on who's been gone the longest, who's closer to going into pay status. Usually by plan year. So you treat everybody in a particular plan year the same way, and you would segregate all of them to whatever percentage you've decided to segregate. And you would work backward until you're segregating and funding the segregation of the most recent terminees or retirees. I would say I've also seen segregation dependent on the employee status, so you might not segregate somebody that's in pay status, like a retiree. They go into pay status almost immediately. You also see, or I see, segregation policies that segregate all terminated participants proportionately to their account balance. So if you have $1 million invested terminated participant accounts or terminated participant accounts, and you've got $100,000 that the plan administrator has decided is going to be used to fund segregation, you would fund the segregation 10% of every terminated participant account balance, and do it across the board that way. That's probably the least controversial approach. But remember that whatever approach you choose for deciding who segregates, it has to be a non-discriminatory result.
There's a question about segregation. Do the funds have to be invested the same way for departed participants as for active participants? I guess the simple answer is mostly segregation is only being applied to people who have already terminated. If we remember back in some of the guidelines, since you're allowed to test terminees as a separate category of people for discriminatory purposes, we're looking at them as a group, and so if you want to segregate them, you can invest them and what's appropriate for that. We usually are not seeing what's called segregation for an active group. I mean, in effect, what you would have would be possibly rebalancing for the actives, reshuffling or segregation for the terminees, and it's quite possible that your investments in those two categories would be, in fact, quite different.
Yeah, I would say you have the same fiduciary duty with respect to the segregated assets as you do for cash or other investments in active participant accounts. It's just that the analysis is usually different for the two groups, and it's appropriately different. So a segregated participant account, those are usually people much closer to retirement age, much closer to getting their benefits. And so you would conclude that the investment policy should be more conservative if those two assumptions are true, and they usually are. Whereas an active participant account, the investments, the cash in that account, is usually more transitory in nature. You funded it in with the purpose of using it for another stock purchase or a second acquisition loan, or it's only there temporary. But as you build longer-term cash assets in the ESOP trust, and that's typically what's happening when you do either rebalancing or reshuffling. You're building up some non-company stock assets in the active participant accounts. As you do that, as the balances become significant, you need to adopt an investment policy there, and that really should follow very much like any other retirement plan investment policy. They're assets that are going to be in the trust for a longer term. They're participants who are younger, farther away from retirement. You need to adopt an investment policy or perhaps pass through the elections and how that money will be invested. A couple more questions here. Would it be best to not have a rebalancing and or reshuffling policy until the ESOP has purchased all of the owner's shares and that the owner wants to sell over a number of years to the plan? That's a good question. If you say you've done a first stage transaction, maybe the ESOP has bought 30% of the company and there are plans to do additional transactions, I would definitely take that into consideration in deciding to rebalance or reshuffle, because that's going to place some demands on cash that goes into the trust. And so I need to understand whether it makes sense to build up any cash in the trust. And typically, if you do have plans to do additional leverage transactions, most companies would postpone the decision to either rebalance or reshuffle until after that debt service is serviced. All right, a couple other questions here before we move on to best practices. All right, so the question is it ever viable to desegregate accounts among previously segregated terminated participants? In the case of the person asking the question, terminated employees have had an ongoing ability to receive a distribution rollover but haven't elected to do so. So you've got cash that's sitting there in the trust. Is it ever appropriate to desegregate that cash? My answer to that is it's possible to do it. I would be reluctant to do it. I would consider very carefully my reasons as a plan fiduciary for deciding to desegregate accounts. There's nothing in the plan document, there's nothing in the IRS guidance to say it absolutely can't be done. I can think of a handful of cases where it might be appropriate to do it, but I'd be very careful about doing it. And I would typically only do it if I was removing the segregation reshuffling provision from the document completely, just changing the policy. And in that case, I would carefully consider whether I wanted to also adopt a rebalancing to replace it so that everybody had the same proportions of each at the end of the day. And I certainly wouldn't do it in the context of the company stock wildly underperforming or outperforming the other investments, the segregated investment balances. There are other ways to try to get rid of the segregated person, the segregated balance, for those that are unwilling to consent to a distribution. There are other levers you can use to try to move them along from the trust, but I wouldn't consider desegregating them.
Yeah, and remember, one of the things that IRS specifically came out and said was there can be a significant detriment for those who fail to consent when you're choosing this reshuffling, because that's exactly what they want to focus in on. You know, people trying to manipulate and basically...
Yeah, I would say that there are some people that adopt a reshuffling provision with the idea, well, these people will not consent to a distribution. I want to get rid of them, so here's the proposal. We've adopted a reshuffling provision in our plan document. If you don't consent to this distribution, we're divesting you of our company stock and we're putting you in a checking account. You're going to earn no return at all. And IRS very specifically addressed that you can't coerce a participant basically to consent to a distribution by using segregation as the lever. So understand again, you have the fiduciary duty to invest that replacement investment, that cash that you get from the stock, prudently, and you should take that very seriously. So just going to highlight a few best practices, and we'll leave a little time for questions here at the end. You should be little or no discretion as to whose accounts will be transferred. It should be a non-discriminatory policy. You can't pick, we're going to segregate Jane, we're not going to segregate Bill because the stock's doing well and Bill was a really great guy, model employee, Ted. You have to treat people by classes, by groups on a non-discriminatory basis. So it's not something you can pick and choose who gets segregated, who does not, whether that's good or bad in your current context. You have discrimination issues if you don't apply segregation reshuffling to all terminees. It can't be, again, what we just stated, it cannot be used in lieu of immediate distribution. You can't use it as a penalty to try to coerce someone to take a distribution. We recommend strongly that segregation should apply to the participant's entire account balance, both their vested and non-vested balance, unless the plan provides for an immediate forfeiture of the non-vested portion. In that case, you could fund just the vested. Two reasons for that. One, just as plan policy, your vested account balance is normally a percentage of your entire account balance. And two, it's a bit of a record-keeping nightmare to only segregate and fund the vested portion of the account. So we strongly recommend, even though the non-vested portion is an eventual forfeiture, that you fund the whole balance, not just the vested. Segregation should be funded as early as possible in the plan year for which it's intended to apply. This is a common question. Let's say we have $100,000 that we want to segregate, but our stock value comes in for our calendar year plan in June. Is it okay to put it in September? And there's not a black and white answer to this question, but I would say that you want to fund the segregation as early as possible, because what you're doing is you're taking away the investment return in the replacement investment. The replacement investment, of course, is the cash that you're putting in the accounts. So to take this to the extreme, I could decide to segregate on December 30 back to the prior year's valuation and give someone only 1 day's investment return. Not a good policy. It's not a good policy for paying benefits normally. You know, you want to pay on as soon as you can administratively to avoid stale valuation issues. So you want to take that into careful consideration. All right. I think We've dropped here. I'm going to go back in to dial back in, try to fix this. Bear with us for a moment.
premiumbeat.com.